Joined on the phone today by Anna Shternshis. She is a Yiddish professor, also project director for the upcoming release, Yiddish Glory, The Lost Songs of WWII. Anna, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, thank you.
Well, first, can you tell the listeners a little bit about the upcoming release here, Yiddish Glory, The Lost Songs of WWII? What are the listeners in for with this new release?
So this project is an unusual work which combined archival research and work with artists. What happened was that a few years ago I came across this document that was stored in the manuscript department of Ukrainian National Library, and they were written in handwritten Yiddish, and upon close examination turned out that these were songs that people wrote during World War II in Ukraine, and the language of these documents was Yiddish, which meant that people who wrote these songs were either surviving or dying during the Holocaust. And the importance of those documents was in the fact that we still don't have much information about what it was like for Jews to live and to die during the Holocaust in Ukraine. We have this information from Poland and from some other places in Europe, but not from the former Soviet Union, not as much. And these were the documents that showed that actually people were singing about the war. They were singing about the atrocities that they witnessed. They were also singing about the need to fight against fascism, and they were fighting against fascism. So none of these songs were written by professional musicians or professional composers or even poets. Usually they were written either by children or by women or people who happened to be there, witnessed what they witnessed, couldn't use prose to describe what they saw, and chose to write songs about this. So again, this was important historically because these are not the voices that we normally hear when we discuss history. So anyway, to make this long story short, and it was a long story because it took about 3 years to get to that project, I worked together with an artist, Psoy Korolenko, who is both a scholar, a philologist, but also an artist, a performer. And we looked at these documents together, and he came up with tunes for these words. Some of them had tunes, but most of them didn't. The tunes that matched the cultural culture of that time, the music of that time. And we selected 18 songs out of hundreds that were there. And later, with the help of the producer Dan Rosenberg, recruited other musicians, such as a Canadian jazz singer Sophie Millman, a Russian violin trio, Loiko, and recorded these documents as songs. So in other words, brought those voices back to life in a way that the contemporary audience will understand and hopefully appreciate. And essentially revived, gave voice to people who we think should be heard in a way that they would have appreciated being heard.
Yeah, it's definitely fascinating that this stuff was just found, all those years just kind of sitting around. And what was the condition like when they were found? And I guess what kind of lengths do you have to go to preserve these old papers?
So the papers were collected by professionals. There was an ethnomusicologist working out of the Soviet Union. His name was Moisei Beregovsky, and he worked at this research lab at the Ukrainian Academy of Science. His job was to work on Yiddish culture. So they did have paper, and they did have pens and pencils, although it was the wartime, so the quality of both was not great. And they also had a typing machine, and the typing machine was also not working very well. So now that these documents were created in 1944, 47, something like that, nobody looked at them since then, and I was looking at them in 2010, 2015. So the quality of paper is not amazing. The quality of writing sometimes it's fine, and sometimes it's hard to read. And also, the art of reading handwritten Yiddish is unfortunately disappearing, and sometimes it's just hard to read, even if it's clear. So the state of the documents is not great, but even harder is the fact that it's still in Ukraine, and although it is an open access, it's not really an open access because it's so far away. So it took some time to actually read these documents, to understand the historical significance, to also get through some censorship that went on there, and that's another story. The reason why these documents were lost and we didn't have them until now was that Moisei Beregovsky and his team were arrested by Joseph Stalin in 1950 in accusation of espionage against the Soviet government. It's another long story. But even after Stalin's death, when they were released in 1956, the documents that were not returned to the family, and as a result, these were documents that that nobody has not only not read but also didn't know that they existed. So it took some time to to understand what they are and decide what to do with them. And my decision was not to publish them immediately as text, although the texts are now published with a CD, but instead bring them back to life as music. And I was very excited that we were able to recruit those amazing world-class musicians to perform these songs. Each one of them believed that they were participating in a historical event by essentially resurrecting both the singers, the authors of the songs, and the scholars who risked their lives and who sacrificed their lives in many ways for preserving this music for us.
Yeah, it's definitely an important part of our history, and again, it's all there in Yiddish Glory, the Lost Songs of World War II. And when it comes to the songs, when you found them, was it obvious, I guess, what the melodies were supposed to be, or did you have to maybe create those or try to recreate them?
So some of them came with tunes, and that was very exciting. For example, there was one song written by a 10-year-old orphan who sings about losing her mother in a concentration camp called Pechora. It's in Ukraine, and that came to us with the tune, and that gave us a chance to actually perform the song. We have a singer who did it, a child singer who did that, and that really gave kind of goosebumps of thinking about how the kid today is singing exactly what that kid then was singing with that same tune. However, many others did not have any tunes with them, but there were some notes created by by Beregovsky. Those notes said two important things. First, that not a single song was written to original tune. So in other words, they all used existing either Soviet or Yiddish tunes. And the second thing, that most of those songs did not really use klezmer music. Very rarely they used Jewish music. In other words, they relied on popular Soviet music. So these were two important pieces of information, but nothing more than that. And Psoy Korolenko was able to look at the text, analyze the text, and the songs, and come up with tunes that he believed matched with what the song would have sounded like. So it was a leap of imagination, but when we performed this music to people, and some of the people who lived through that time heard it, said, well, we don't know exactly that song, but it sounded something like it. So very often we, I think, managed to hit the jackpot on how the songs are supposed to sound.
Again, we're on the phone today with Anna Shternshis. She's a Yiddish professor and a project director for Yiddish Glory, the Lost Songs of World War II. And as you mentioned, such a treat for the musicians who were able to provide these new recordings. Were you able to attribute a lot of the songs to the authors and maybe perhaps track down relatives that are still around?
So we tried to do that, but because there are names of people who sang these songs. And a little bit of Soviet context is perhaps useful here, because You see, during the war, right after the war in the Soviet Union, it was not quite safe to say that a Jew or anyone else survived the war under the German occupation. The Soviets believed that if a Jew survived the war under the German occupation, there must have been because they collaborated with the German army, and that's why they should be punished. So a lot of Soviet Holocaust survivors went to jail right after the war because they were not able to prove that they were not collaborating with Germans. How do you prove that? So a lot of people, even if they survived the war in the Soviet Union under the German occupation, even if they survived in ghetto or in hiding, did not admit to that. So when they sang these songs, they said often, I heard it from a friend. I heard it from a neighbor. I don't know where I heard it. So even if they sang it, they don't usually say that they're the ones who wrote this. So it is hard to trace the actual authors. We did find some interesting things. For example, some of the songs were recorded by a Yiddish poet and artist. His name is Mendel Mann, and he recorded a few songs. He recorded, by recorded, I mean he wrote the words down, which he said that he recorded from a Red Army soldier. Well, he himself was a Red Army soldier, and he survived the war. He actually died in the 70s. His name is Mendel Mann. Became an artist, was collaborated with Chagall. But we have one of the songs that he wrote. It's called My Machine Gun on that album. But we don't know if he actually wrote that song. The documents say that he recorded this song from someone else. And all these names, I'm a historian, I'm a specialist in Soviet Jewish culture, and so especially Soviet Yiddish literature and culture. I checked them against all the sources that we have, and we were not able to find any actual professional poets with these names. So I think it's safe to assume that these were genuinely amateur authors who were writing songs because they didn't want to write prose. They didn't want to write down a narrative of what they witnessed, and they believed that songs will do this job better.
Well, again, the new collection, Yiddish Glory, the Lost Songs of World War II. And, for the listeners out there, even if you don't trace your roots, back to Jewish or Russian or Ukraine, definitely is still a fascinating collection.
Thank you.
Well, I know you have, Anna, some speaking engagements coming up around the country. Is there maybe anything else in the works or anything else upcoming?
Oh, well, thank you for asking about that. So I just wrote a book called When Sonia Met Boris, An Oral History of Jewish Life Under Stalin. And it just came out from Oxford University Press in 2017. And it's based on oral histories that I collected with Soviet Jews born in the 1920s. 474 people were interviewed for this project, asking them what it was like to live normal life under extraordinary abnormal circumstances in the Soviet Union, because these are people who lived through Stalin's Soviet Union. And these are stories of their families, stories of their careers, stories of their hard choices and adjustments and compromises that they had to make of living and surviving in Stalin's Russia. And what's interesting about this is that it's based on oral history. So essentially I was talking about with the survivors, with the same generation of people who sang the songs for Berezovsky during World War II. And I recorded those interviews in the United States and Canada and Germany and Russia. And not a single time I was able to find a person who would remember a Yiddish song written during the war at this time. So they remembered songs written in the 1930s, they remembered songs written in the 1950s, but they did not sing for me any of the songs written during the war. So when I found this archive, it turned out that, and all these oral history interviews would tell me that, during the war, we didn't really speak much Yiddish. Maybe sometimes we'd write letters to our parents in Yiddish, but generally Yiddish was not a language of public culture. But when we found this archive in Kiev, it turns out that actually was not true. Yiddish was the language of public culture. Yiddish was a language of folklore. It's just that memory did not preserve that information. So it's one of these times when history and memory are telling different stories.
Well, again, fascinating work that you've done here, Anna, and the Yiddish Glory, Lost Songs of World War II is out. And, again, I could talk to you for another hour or so, but thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
And again, that was Anna Shternshis, a Yiddish professor, project director for the Yiddish Glory, the Lost Songs of World War II collection.